Hello and welcome to the AWS Migration and Modernization Podcast, Security Considerations Edition. My name is Clark Rogers. I'm with the Office of the CISO here at AWS Security. Today I'm joined by Sara Lofgren, AWS Solution Architecture Manager. Sara, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Clark. I'm Sara Lofgren, Senior Solutions Architecture Manager for AWS.
Sara, when customers are starting to think about their migration journey, what are some of the first security questions they should be asking?
I think there's a couple things that customers need to think about as they're looking to move to the cloud, migrate their data centers. And probably the most important one is, probably the most obvious one, is you need to have a very good inventory of what you have. And when I say inventory, I'm not just talking about hardware, what racks and switches and equipment you have in your data center, but what are your applications? Where does your regulated data live? What are your high priority workloads? And probably not surprising to a lot of people watching this, there are a lot of challenges with keeping a good inventory, and that really is the starting point and the basis for a good migration. The second piece is having a handle on your risk and your compliance program and what you're planning on considering as you move to the cloud. So what compliance regimes do I need to think about? And where is my highly regulated data, and what is that going to look like as it turns into a cloud application?
And going a little bit further with that, so we have the sort of security view of moving to the cloud, and then the sort of the business side of looking to the cloud, looking to move to the cloud. When should the security conversations start? Right, because this is presumably new for everyone as they're moving. Does security sort of figure out, hey, what business applications are going to be moving first and then address them, or do they have conversations earlier in the cycle? What does it look like, or what is the best practice?
I think security should be involved from the very beginning. They should already be involved as you're running your software in the data center. But as you're looking to move to the cloud, they should be involved in which cloud are we moving to? What are we going to move to the cloud? What is the timeline for all of these things? They should be there to help with the inventory process, to help categorize everything, and really be a partner along the whole journey for migration.
Have you seen, in your experience, and we've both been doing this for quite some time, any common pitfalls that either security teams make or non-security teams make that have a security context to them?
I think you kind of touched on it when you asked me about when should security be involved. I think the biggest pitfall I see is that security in a traditional data center environment and in a company that's been established for a long time tends to be a very centralized organization that is there to establish guidelines and gates after the priorities are already set by the business for what applications are going to be important to their business and what software they want to run, whether it's in the data center or in the cloud. And then security comes in after the fact and says, well, guys, we're going to put the brakes on here. And so it can cause a lot of friction, and it can cause a lot of setbacks in your whole migration process. So again, getting the security in there earlier helps companies be more successful. And part of the challenge with centralized organizations of security is they're not really there at the onset. They're there as a check-in after the process has already been initiated and the software has already been written. Clark, you've talked to a lot of our customers. You've seen a lot of these migrations. You also work with a lot of our executives. What considerations do you think customers should have when they're looking at security in the cloud?
Well, I think our well-architected framework really sets it out quite nicely. And when I talk to customers, and we talk about relating what you do on-prem today versus what you can do in the cloud, there's some core foundational items that really translate well just from a mental model perspective. We call them the core 5 because guess what? There's 5 of them. The first one is all about identity, right? So when we think about the differences between on-prem and in the cloud, on-prem, you might build your entire infrastructure and then grant access to it. As you well know, in the cloud, you have to grant access first before you can get access to any of the resources. So really thinking about how you're going to approach identity, and you're asking questions like, am I taking my Active Directory over? Am I using some other identity and authorization source? How is this going to integrate with AWS IAM? Am I going to use multi-factor authentication? Hopefully, yes, right? And what are my assets going to be doing in the cloud, whether they're human or non-human identities? So really everything about that identity stack. And then once you've defined who or what is going to be operating in the cloud, you have to think about your sort of detective controls, the logging and monitoring, right? What is that person or entity going to be doing? So what do I need to collect, and then how am I going to collect it? And of course, in AWS, it's CloudTrail and CloudWatch and all these kinds of tools. What's important to me, right? If a person tries to access something that they shouldn't, do I need to get a certain kind of alert? Does that feed into my SOC? Do I care? Do I not care? And of course, this is a different answer for different types of organizations. Highly regulated organizations are going to learn something. Others may not care as much or may not be forced into that. So the monitoring part is also very, very important for customers to think about. Next up is what we'll call traditional infrastructure security, right? So network segmentation, firewalls, patching, vulnerability management, all that kind of thing. They know how to do it on-prem. How do you do it in the cloud? And just sort of work through that. And again, we talked about having parity at minimum as you move into the cloud, but maybe you can do it better. One of the anecdotes I've liked from one of my colleagues is the whole idea of cattle versus pets, right? So traditionally, you might love your server in your server room back at the data center, and you care and feeding it and all that kind of thing. When it's just code, maybe you don't patch it anymore, right? Maybe you just release it all through the CI/CD stack, and you get every time you release, it's a freshly patched server instance, and you're good to go. So it's a different mental model, but you're really thinking about that infrastructure security as a whole. Next up is data protection, right? So especially in the days of AI, what is my data? Where is it? How is it classified? Who has access to it? All those kinds of things. But then also the resilience conversation, the what if this happens, or maybe there's a regulatory compliance aspect to your data that you need to protect it in a certain way. So you're going to have the encryption conversation, right? What am I encrypting? It's pretty cheap and easy to encrypt everything in the cloud. It's no longer an excuse. What do my backup strategies look like? What do my BCP and recovery strategies look like? Is one or more AZs appropriate? Or do I need to think about architecting things across multiple regions? Those types of conversations. And then lastly, we talked about this earlier, incident response planning, right? You can do everything right with those first four. There's a 0 day you didn't account for, something bad happens, or you missed something, right? Security is an iterative process. So incident response, do my incident responders have access to AWS? Do they know what AWS is? Can they operate in there? Do they have an understanding of how things are architected so that they can then react appropriately to get the business back up and running when something bad happens? And then another consideration that customers need to be thinking about is the regulatory and compliance aspects of everything that they're doing. So across those core five, am I checking the right boxes for whatever regulatory regime that I need to adhere to?
I think you touched on a couple interesting things that are important to really consider early on.
Yep.
Before you start building in the cloud. So the identity foundation is an interesting one. It can be really tempting to use access keys, for example. So it's a really easy way for developers to get into the cloud. Maybe you haven't set up federation yet, and your developers just create access keys when they need to get in. Well, that sounds like a good idea. It's controlled. It's something that the developer has versus, a password they're going to write down on a piece of paper.
Right.
But the reality is, you're creating technical debt because now you have a proliferation of access keys. The same thing with tending to your cattle. So it's really important to have a good, golden AMI program, a way that you're managing your images themselves. And so considering all of those things as you're building out your cloud and the security around your cloud, I think doing it early days is going to lend to better results and less technical debt down the road.
100%. So for our customers who are in this sort of hybrid mode, right? So they have workloads that they still need to maintain and operate securely on-prem, and now they have workloads in production that they have to operate securely in the cloud. That security operations team, what does it look like, right? Because it's hybrid as well, and how does it operate as effectively as possible?
So I think there's a tendency to want to take your traditional SOC and bolt it onto your cloud. And I would say it's a mistake to do that because you're going to limit yourself to what tools and capabilities you have for visibility into the cloud because there's so much more that you can do there. But if you take your centralized SOC, you can't just shut it down when you start moving stuff to the cloud. So there is going to be a period of time there where you do have competing priorities and two sets of cloud security tools. It's not ideal, but the reality is that it's something that you need to accept. If you try to just put a square peg into a round hole, it's not going to work. So the benefit, though, being that in the cloud, with the guardrails that you can put in and the way that you can manage security operations decentralized, you can start to alleviate some of that pain on your security operations team. So even though they are picking up those new things with automation, with guardrails, it's not going to be the same volume, and it's not going to be, folks sitting on call at night in an operations center watching for red lights like you do in a traditional data center. So over time, the plan should be to deprecate that and move to modern, cloud native monitoring capabilities and tools, and consider automation wherever possible so you don't need to have this aggregation of logs and visibility in a centralized location anymore. If you're willing to relinquish that over time and have a plan to deprecate it, you can probably have better security outcomes in the long run.
And then, so what does that transition look like for the human SOC operator, right? So we've talked earlier today about security engineering and more of a developer focus and mindset. If you have a SOC of, let's say, 10 people, are you taking a third or a half of them and making them cloudify, quote unquote, their jobs while the rest do things more traditionally, and then sort of the lessons learned and then they bring them on, or what have you seen work well?
I think I've seen more often than not a shift toward more security engineers that are building automation and security tooling and trying to eliminate the need for that human oversight and that complex forensic and aggregation work that has to happen in a SOC for operations. It doesn't completely go away, but I think you can reduce the number of people you have working on that task over time as you do use the automation tools that are at your disposal, and with agentic AI, potentially automating more of those responses and having less of a need for humans doing all of that work of a security operations center.
And I think things have also sort of evolved over the years. 15 years ago, when companies were first starting to look at the cloud, I remember the CISOs being literally the department of no. Like, we're not going to put our data in somebody else's data center, all this kind of thing. Over time, the cloud has been a proven entity, and it's actually, you can be more secure in the cloud than you were on-prem. But I think some of these other challenges still evolve.
It's interesting to see the evolution of security teams as they look to modernize and they look to agile development and try to help companies accelerate to the cloud. So if you view your security organization as a business accelerator, one of the folks on my team has a saying, why do you put brakes on a car? It's not so the car can stop, it's so the car can go fast.
For sure.
So your security organization is there to help enable the business. So if you can do it in such a way by implementing guardrails and constraints to allow your teams to accelerate their work and shorten the time to deployment for production workloads, you can have a big benefit to the business, and security can actually become the department of, yes, but how do we help you get there quickly and safely?
For sure. So one of the mental models that we use with customers in thinking about security in the cloud is the shared responsibility model. Could you explain that just a little bit, and then your thoughts on it and how it helps customers?
Sure. So in a traditional data center, you own the security from the hardware on up. Well, you own the security of the data center itself. So if we draw a line in the cloud from what is still your responsibility and what is now your cloud host's responsibility. We move up the stack. So now you don't need to worry about the data center. You don't need to worry about the hardware. And a lot of times, if you look at the more modern software options in the cloud, like containers and Lambda on AWS, you give folks the option to not have to worry about the software running on the systems anymore. So rather than it being this is your responsibility and this is our responsibility, it's, hey, we're actually going to take a lot of those worries off of your security team. And so the important thing to understand is, where is that line? And it kind of moves depending on what you're deploying, whether you're doing a simple lift and shift of a server, running a Windows database and putting it on EC2,
Sure.
or you want to convert something to be completely serverless, and then you remove that software layer, operating system layer.
And then there's also the regulatory and compliance aspect of the shared responsibility model.
Yeah, so now you don't need to worry about certifying the underlying operating systems, because that work's already been done for you. If you look at our Trust Center on AWS, it's a website you can visit. We've been really thoughtful about how we go about getting certifications and how we build, monitor, manage vulnerabilities, patch systems in order to adhere to the most stringent regulations globally, because we have customers in all business segments, and a lot of them have pretty stringent requirements. So you get the benefit of that no matter what your organization is building and what compliance regimes apply to you.
And to your point, that the attestation burden for the customer is lowered because you can inherit a certain amount of controls straight from AWS, and I believe the latest number is about 143 of them, different attestations that we have out there, which actually reduces the workload, which allows you to actually move faster and be more innovative as a customer. What have you seen with the mental shifts, I guess, on security teams specifically? So today they're on-prem, they run all of their security tooling that they have. Is it as simple as taking that existing security tooling and just dropping it into AWS to achieve the same outcome?
I wouldn't say that that's as simple as it sounds. I actually think that's really challenging, and I think companies get a little married to their existing investments and licensing and the software that their teams are familiar running. I think it's a mistake to take your data center and move it to the cloud thinking that it's just somebody else running your data center, and you're going to still have the same underlying platforms and infrastructure monitoring. You have the benefit of an abstraction layer when you move to the cloud. And this can allow you to rethink the way that you run your security. So now you have visibility into the underlying pieces in a way you didn't before, and you can do so in a very uniform way that you couldn't do when you were running a whole bunch of different hardware pieces. But where I have seen customers stumble is they have really talented, strong infrastructure teams. And they've been doing things a certain way, monitoring their network, for example, and they want to just build the same thing in the cloud so they can keep doing the job they were already doing. And that actually slows innovation, and it can cause problems with having to rebuild their existing infrastructure stack in the cloud, which is costly and it's slow.
Right.
And it ties you into sort of traditional software models and security teams limitations that you wouldn't have if you just don't try to build the exact same thing in the cloud.
So you run a team of security solution architects for some of our most prestigious customers. How do you and your colleagues sort of broach that conversation with those customer security teams about thinking differently about how to operate in the cloud?
Well, I would say tactfully. Companies have a lot of investment in what they've been doing, and no team likes to hear that they're getting deprecated or that their role is no longer relevant. So we try to do it through an education process. We offer education and modifying the team's skills and enticing them to learn new things and think about it differently, with the benefit they're actually going to be able to do their work faster, and it becomes a lot more fun when you're not doing the same old grind stuff that you were doing previously. So education being the first piece, but I think the second piece is bringing a culture of security to our customers. So we talk a lot about culture of security at Amazon, and it's a couple things to us. One, it's a blameless culture. So you have to encourage your employees to report when they see things that are bad. But you can't do so in such a way that's going to result in somebody getting in trouble. So you try to learn from your mistakes. So if you encourage everybody to report what they see and to be very diligent and mindful, they all become security owners. So you get better response time, you get more visibility into what's going on, but you also alleviate some of the concern about people not wanting to turn in their employees. The second piece of culture of security is that ownership piece with every team. So if you start to distribute your security ownership out to your teams instead of having just a strong centralized org, it helps teams accept that this is part of my job and potentially apply that to modernizing the way that they're working. If they consider security to be part of their job, then they don't get so married to the thing they were doing before in the traditional way that they were doing it.
And then by putting security, I guess, as close to the actual work that's being conducted, you actually have a more secure organization because it's the people who know what they're building and they know how to secure it best, with guidance from the security teams themselves.
Yeah, and they want to do it earlier and better. So they apply those security concepts that they've now imparted as part of their own mental model for building and running systems. And it results in better code, better designed applications, and less friction when you're doing your threat modeling and trying to move code to production.
Got it. And then is implementing this culture of security, does that help the sort of traditional, hopefully not traditional for very long, mentality of around security's not my job, I'm going to throw it over the wall to ops, and ops is going to run my code, and that sort of thing, that sort of, does it break down the silos?
I think it helps. I don't know that anybody has a magic formula for breaking down silos in organizations. If they do, I'd love to hear it. But certainly giving folks some power and control over their own destiny can be a rewarding thing. And you also can give recognition. So if you implement some sort of security champions program, you can call people out, and whether it's just keeping track of how many security vulnerabilities they report or how many threat models they do for their team, and give them some sort of recognition, people tend to respond really positively to that.
Love it, love it. You talked about modern security architectures, so serverless and containers, those types of things. Do those bring more security risk, less security risk, different security risk? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think they do bring less security risk. And we talked about the shared responsibility model. So if you take away all of the concern of running the operating systems and patching and monitoring them, now you have a more discrete set of problems. It's a smaller number of problems. And also when you're operating in the realm of software, it's easier to apply guardrails. So one of the things I remember years ago working with firewalls and traditional data centers is we were still struggling with east-west segmentation. So it was easy to set a firm boundary to perimeter for security, but it was harder to monitor and stop traffic between applications within your data center. So we were chasing this dream of software-defined networking. Well, you have that now in the cloud.
For sure.
You can get as granular as down to every system, every workload, every Lambda or container that's running. So you can set these boundaries that you couldn't set before, but you can also do so in an automated way. You can set up guardrails and do software-defined boundaries, do infrastructure as code. And so you can do so in a way that's repeatable, that's consistent, that's very secure and easy to monitor. And it's also easy to recognize when you have a lack of adherence to those guardrails and to those policies. So it gives you a level of control and granularity that you didn't have before. And this is one of the reasons I say the cloud is better for security than a traditional data center.
And we've talked quite often about provable security and our automated reasoning mechanisms, where basically it's math, right? This device can either talk to the internet or it can't, and having it all in code makes it that much easier for security teams to understand, is the quote unquote perimeter or the interior or whatever you need to have it secure.
So I think the consistency and the provability of code and serverless applications does open up the potential for interesting applications of more modern technology. I don't want to jump the gun and bring up generative AI and agentic AI, but I think there's a ton of opportunity here with things that are somewhat predictable and very repeatable, and something that humans have been doing that's a lot of repetition that we can potentially apply AI to and add a new level of security.
I want to go back to the idea of the security champions program that you were talking about. I know at AWS we call it security guardians, but names are names, right? Can you give me a little more detail on what that looks like from an implementation perspective at a customer, right? Is this completely run by the security organization? Does the C-suite need to get involved to say that it's important? Can you sort of walk through those kinds of mechanics for me?
I think executive sponsorship is always important if you want something to become part of your culture and not just another failed attempt to do something. If you have executive sponsorship and a mandate even to implement a program, it becomes a lot easier to remove the friction and get adoption of the program. And so what I've seen, and I've seen this at AWS and I've seen this at other customers as well, is you create a program with the people who have been doing the threat modeling, the code security, which traditionally has been your central AppSec team. Mm-hmm. And you have them sit down with your developers and you train them how to do the threat modeling. And it doesn't need to be everybody. Everybody is not going to buy into it. Not everybody loves security. Threat modeling's not for everybody.
And just to be clear, is this everybody in the organization, or are you picking a particular development team to start with, right, to sort of experiment with and move forward?
Everything should be done in a phased approach if you want something to be successful, but the goal should be broad adoption in all development teams. You would ideally have at least one person on every product team and every software team that knows how to do threat modeling. And so sitting down with your peer and running through threat modeling exercise is way better than meeting with that dark, scary centralized security team, application security team that's there to tell you no. And so you're working with your own team, you work with them day in, day out, and you go through this process. And the more you do it, the more it becomes a reflex. And so if you start with a targeted team and you implement this on a trial basis, generally what we've seen is that it's very successful. And after you have one or two teams doing it, now you have folks trained up, now you have a program to do it, now people know the drill, and then you can pick and prioritize which teams you're going to want to do. And I would tend to want to prioritize the teams that are handling the highest risk code.
Okay.
Because you want to have the best security outcomes and also the least amount of friction on those teams to help themselves get shipped software out the door.
And then I guess if you're successful with the people working with the most sensitive code, then you can say, well, if it works for them, it's going to work for you as well.
That's right.
What are some metrics of success in a program like that? I would imagine it would be things like catching security issues earlier in the development process, maybe higher throughput velocity for actual features. Are there some others?
Well, I think those are two big ones, is how many vulnerabilities do you catch? Where are you catching them in the pipeline?
Not the night before production, right?
Ideally not, but you're glad you caught it the night before production instead of the night after production. But you definitely want to catch those early. And you also look at how long it takes for you to go from feature complete to production. And you want to see how much you can reduce that timeline. And what we've seen with organizations is when I ask a company that has a traditional pipeline, and I've seen this, oftentimes one person in the room, the executive, will say, it's 15 days from code complete to production. And then somebody from ops will say, actually, it's 45. And then somebody else will say, well, I saw 67 days.
Right.
And then there's silence in the room. How can we make this better? And I think that should be one of your main goals for your program, is how do we get our business getting code out the door faster? You want those sprints to be short. You want that code to be going out, because you're not innovating if you're spending time talking to your AppSec team, talking to your lawyers, talking to all of these folks that have gates that are preventing you from getting that code out. I've talked to developers that say, I wrote that feature last year. It's still not in production.
Oh my.
And that's so frustrating for organizations. So a good security champions program can help take away that reality.
And then I would think from a purely business context, because again, any kind of program is going to cost money, either legitimate dollars or taking somebody off working something on else to develop the program. When you look at success metrics, I think selling it as we're going to be able to move faster, and therefore you're going to be able to make decisions in your market that you typically would not be able to make, because maybe you can make a pivot in weeks instead of months or years
Yeah.
as things happened in the past.
Yeah, there's a financial benefit, though, even to doing this, in that when your developers are sitting with the app stack and sitting at all those gates, they're still using up their time. And oftentimes there's dependencies on previous releases for them to move on to the next one. So you're delaying them. They might just be sitting there twiddling their thumbs.
Right.
So having them take ownership of the security in that security program can actually reduce the amount of time they're wasting on security challenges. So they might actually be more productive in their code writing by also owning the security piece on the team.
Love it. Love it. So earlier we talked about during the sort of migration phase, and I appreciate migrations can take weeks, they could take a year. It really depends on how large the organization is. But during the migration phase, security teams are more than likely looking at the security outcomes that they need to achieve in the cloud, so they're at least on parity with what they were doing on-prem. And that can look like, maybe I'll take some of the tools I do have and find the AWS version that's available in the marketplace, just so I have that comfort in using the same GUI or whatever the case may be. At what point do you see security teams starting to lean into native AWS functionality? The security teams get comfortable with infrastructure as code. Is there such thing as security as code?
I think that's part of your infrastructure as code.
Right.
Those guardrails that you put in, those controls, implementation of specific identity policies, applying cloud native solutions like guard duty, enabling certain services for any AWS account that gets deployed. Those things can be security as code. Right. If you automate everything and you set guardrails and you use, let's say, something like Control Tower, if you're running AWS organizations, you can set series of standards for security and really constrain your AWS account's default configurations and behavior to be more secure.
So for the skill set for that security engineer moving from totally on-prem to now a sort of hybrid environment, what does that look like? What is that security engineer doing now in the cloud that he or she was not necessarily doing on-prem before?
I would hope that they're spending more time building controls and thinking about guardrails rather than reacting to things that are violations. It's a lot easier to limit the number of anomalies you have if you have a better set of guardrails and constraints in your environment for your developers versus just reacting and playing whack-a-mole to every new thing that pops up. Because the bounds when you're running a data center are infinite. When you're running in a cloud and especially when you modernize and you start using cloud native services, you're now drastically limiting the scope of what's possible for vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. And so that gives you time to focus on proactive controls rather than reactive controls. And so you're spending a lot more time working with your developers to get their code out the door quickly and implementing guardrails and controls that automate security. And then you can get down to the fun stuff where you're actually doing real forensic investigations on real, unique 0 days. Not that I wish that on any company, but you can spend time doing that stuff instead of just responding to the same misconfigured thing over and over again because you don't have those controls in the data center. I think security teams tend to evolve better and more willingly to moving to the cloud than infrastructure teams in a lot of times because their job becomes more fun.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. You mentioned the proactive benefits of having the visibility in the cloud and being able to put those guardrails in place. We all know that all the proper planning in the world, you can't escape a certain 0 day or something bad that's going to happen. So investments in incident response can't really stop. Can you talk a little bit about how incident response in the cloud is or is not any different than how you do things on-prem?
I think there's a lot of similarities with incident response and wanting to have a playbook and a plan. And a lot of companies don't necessarily think about this when it comes to the cloud. Do I have just-in-time access to get into those critical systems? Now that I've automated everything and I've applied a lot of guardrails and constraints and removed a lot of the operator access that I had for day-end maintenance before, I still need to make sure I do have a way in for my forensic team. And I think it's important that companies consider that. What's your plan? How are you going to get in touch with your cloud provider really quickly? Do they offer any kind of support and help for doing that? A lot of times cloud vendors will help you with investigations and forensics, and they may not even charge for that service. It might be part of what they do with support. I've seen some really positive and rapid response, and cloud companies know their underlying infrastructure so well they can often identify something really quickly. And they've also seen it before because they have the benefit of looking across thousands of customers. So the patterns have already emerged.
So the mental model around incident response really doesn't change. You still want to have your senior leaders getting together and doing tabletop exercises, all those kinds of things that you would have done on-prem in the past. It's just now with more of a cloud lens to it.
I would say, yeah, you definitely need to make sure you have the same foundation, the same response plan. I think your SLAs can get shorter with cloud response.
Are there any, I'll call them traditional, security controls that go away when you move to the cloud?
I've seen a consolidation or migration of certain security aspects. I was talking about microsegmentation before. You saw some pretty complex, hefty, next-generation firewall infrastructures deployed to remote sites, deployed to data centers before. And with that software-defined networking piece, you can remove a lot of those components. As you constrain down and you move away from the bigger operating system-based virtualization and move to containers and serverless, you can start to remove or invest less in those agent-based softwares for monitoring the operating system health as well.
Got it. And then if we look at a company that's made the move, so they started their migration, now let's just say they're all in the cloud and no more on-prem estate. How do the security teams think differently at this point, right? So they effectively have no software constraints at this point. They are security engineers with a developer mindset. What can they do now that they haven't been able to do in the past?
I think there's a tremendous opportunity for automation. Humans are what introduces the most risk to an environment, whether intentionally or more often unintentionally. And with clouds being really a software-based construct, you now have the ability to write automation. And I would say that 90% of a security person's job is spent working on 10% of the problems that are often repeatable and predictable. And so if you can automate away a lot of what your security folks' time is spent on, again, that opens up the opportunity to work on the interesting stuff and the rare stuff and the edge cases of things that you can't automate response to.
Got it. So as you hinted earlier in the conversation, we're not going to be able to leave this conversation without talking about AI in one way, shape, or form. How are you seeing with your customers AI having an effect on, let's just talk about security teams first before we talk about the larger organization.
So there's two pieces to security around generative AI. We saw traditional AI. Well, let's get it out of the way first. We saw traditional AI in security for a long time, whether you're using it for malware, pattern recognition, detecting anomalies in logs, et cetera. But when we talk about generative AI, which everybody's talking about now, there's two things you need to think about. Security of the generative AI and then security using generative AI.
Okay.
And security of AI, all of the traditional things still apply to a software-based workload. You're still looking at all of the things, and you need a good identity foundation, you need encryption, security along the entire route for your data flow, you want to have good data governance, you want to make sure that it's secured from a network perspective. So defense and depth, that all still applies. But there's some interesting new things with generative AI being non-deterministic. So you have risks for your inputs and you have risk for your outputs. Is the input going to be misinterpreted? Is somebody going to interfere with it? Is somebody going to intentionally poison it to cause a malicious output? And if you're using generative AI in an agentic way, meaning that you have it actually operating and making decisions and doing something with an agent, you have the output potentially the output could be hallucinated and bad anyway with this technology, but you have the chance for it to go awry and do something bad. So how do you set bounds for your workload? So that's the first piece.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the more interesting thing for security folks is the application of agentic AI to security. So we know that the threat actors are looking at using generative AI to create potentially polymorphic malware or to find novel ways to write new pieces of malicious code. And it also allows
even well-written phishing emails, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You can certainly automate your phishing campaign using AI to write those emails for you. But with security teams, there's an opportunity for them to potentially automate some threat detection and incident response. There's potential for an agentic SOC. So have a lot of those security operations operated by an agent, especially stuff that you can constrain to a limit of what it's able to do and what it should do. And it's for something that's more predictable outcomes. There's an opportunity here to alleviate the strain on those repetitive tasks and allow AI to do that for you. And then you use the human to make the high-risk decisions.
You talked about putting guardrails in on either the agents or just generative AI in general. If you're introducing an agent to your process, at what point do you feel comfortable that it's doing what you expect it to do, so then you can maybe move on to the next step of the process that you're going to automate?
Well, like any piece of code, you have to go through a test cycle. And there are frameworks out there for threat modeling.
Okay.
One that I'm familiar with agentic AI is Maestro, is a threat model out there that kind of gives you those constraints for what to look for with an agentic system. So you run through your threat modeling to make sure that there isn't a risk of it doing something bad. You're going to want to test it. You have your test cases for these are the scenarios that this agent might interface with, and this is the expected outcomes. And as your teams are thinking about doing this over and over again with agentic AI and using these threat models to apply to it, and also thinking about OWASP top 10 and all of those things, if you run through these operations enough time, you'll start to recognize, here are the ways that we can try to trick the model.
Got it.
And make it do something it shouldn't do. So I think teams are already looking at this. I'm seeing a lot of this here at Amazon. People are using generative AI for a lot of cool tasks. It's definitely interesting to seeing all the new tools popping up. They're popping up really quickly, too. It's exciting, but you do need to go through those activities.
And I would imagine with your experience through migrations and now agentic AI, what the cloud brought to on-prem, there's an aspect of what AI brings to the cloud, right, from a people perspective.
I think there's always that promise of improved productivity and innovation.
Doing more with less and all that sort of thing, yeah.
Yeah, so agentic AI it's just a tool, but it's an innovation that can change the way that we work, just like cloud did. So that always comes with risks, but it also comes with opportunities.
So in closing, Sara, is anything else you'd like to share with the audience today?
Yeah, I think I'd just like to remind our customers that security is not just possible in the cloud, it's actually better. And you should approach your migration journey with optimism and hopefulness in the future, because I do think that the outcome is going to be good for our customers as they look to migrate to the cloud.
Fantastic advice. Sara, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us today.